Greetings to our YouTube subscribers worldwide. I'm Coach Ervin, and with me is Coach Brian. We are 9.09er. Before we talk about how to improve your vocabulary in IELTS speaking, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Why? That's because we upload new content regarding IELTS, OET, PTE, and TOEFL every week. So that means to say you get to have access to new videos about these high-stakes English examinations. Now, I'll turn you over to Sir Brian to give you an overview of vocabulary as a criterion. That's because in these examinations, most examiners are going to assess your performance on the 4 criteria. There's fluency, pronunciation, and delivery. Number 3, vocabulary. Number 4, grammar. Because this video in particular is going to help you improve your vocabulary. We'll focus on this criterion. So, Sir Brian, let's begin with vocabulary in IELTS speaking.
So in IELTS speaking, vocabulary pertains to your range and accuracy of usage or words. So when we talk about range, we are referring to the number of words that you're using. You don't want to be repetitive in the examination, or you don't want to utilize the same terminologies over and over again, because this is going to limit your range. But apart from that, you also want to show to the examiner that you have correct usage. So you're not just using a word just because it's impressive or it sounds good. You're using it because it's appropriate to the context or to the message that you want to convey.
That's correct. So, as Sir Brian mentioned, there are others who have an idea what vocabulary is all about. It's just that they're confused with the information that's available online. Some instructors tell them to use simple language, while the others insist that they use complicated language. So we at 9.09er would like to remind everyone, number 1, it has to be correct. Meaning to say, make sure that the word or the phrase that you're using is appropriate in the context of your response. But number 2, you cannot use exactly the same words and phrases. That's why this video is going to help you build your vocabulary in IELTS speaking. Let's begin with the 3 tasks. So task 1, introduction and interview. This is going to last for about 5 minutes. Imagine if the examiner is going to ask you 3 topics of 3 questions each. That's roughly 9 questions for task 1. And if you're only given 5 minutes for this round, that means the examiner is going to ask you to talk for approximately 30 seconds per round. But why is it, Sir Brian, that it's important for the candidates to build their vocabulary in task 2? That's because task 2 is considered the
long term. This is actually the part in which you're supposed to deliver a lengthy speech, about approximately a couple of minutes, or 1 minute minimum to 2 minutes. So if your vocabulary is very limited, there is a very bleak chance that you're going to be able to accomplish the task and finish your 2-minute speech and be able to demonstrate the full range and extent of your language ability. So it's really very important that you build your vocabulary, especially for this part of the examination.
And when we move on to task 3, this is two-way discussion. So for task 1, you're allowed to talk for about 30 seconds per response. Task 2, 1 to 2 minutes. But for task 3, this is known as the follow-up round. So the examiner right here is going to allow you to talk for up to 1 minute per response, depending on the time left. Usually it's in task 3 when the examiner knows that you're running out of words. Why? Because you've exhausted all the words in task 1 and task 2. That's why it's vital to widen your vocabulary to prove to your examiner that you have not just accuracy, but range at the same time. So we're done with vocabulary as a criterion, and we've talked about the 3 tasks in speaking. Now let's move on to the handout that we have prepared for you. So Sir Brian, tell us more about this handout and how they can have access to these PDF handouts.
This is actually the printed version of the handouts that we have online at nineronline.com. If you subscribe and if you are already an enrollee of 9.09er English, you will get access to these handouts, which are absolutely downloadable. They're printable. You can use them anytime and anywhere. You can also use your mobile devices to access our handouts, and also your laptop or your PC to view all of our PDF handouts. And you can also get them printed like this one if you're more comfortable with looking at a piece of paper instead of using a digital device. This is available again at www.nineronenglish.com if you subscribe to our IELTS Platinum review package.
So guys, if you are an enrollee of 9.09er, all you have to do is to click access your dashboard. However, if you just want to have a free trial, we can offer it to you totally free of charge. All you have to do is to come up with an account and voila, we're going to give you free access. So most of the candidates have difficulty with your opening statements. So, Sir Brian, let's consider samples of opening statements that candidates can probably mention at the beginning of their speaking responses.
Most of the candidates just begin with a simple phrase like I think, I believe, and in my opinion. These are very common ways of starting, especially in part 2 of the examination, or they launch immediately into their answers. But here are some suggestions on how you can actually start your part 2 differently. So one of the examples in this handout is I want to tell you about. That's actually a very good way of starting your speech. I want to tell you about an experience that I had when I was late for work. So that's actually a very good way of starting your speech for part 2 of your examination. Another one would be, let me talk about. For example, you can say, let me talk about this one item that I would want to purchase in the future.
So one concern of IELTS candidates is how to start. But concern number 2 is organization. Like somewhere along the way, they're a bit lost. That's why we at 9.09er would like to recommend a simple outline, most especially in task 2, because you are on your own to talk about the task or the specific subject matter for 1 to 2 minutes. Don't forget to ask yourself the 5 W's and 1 H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. So as Sir Brian mentioned earlier, he gave you an example about an instance when you came in late. So earlier he said, today I'd like to talk about an instance when I came in late. So ask yourself the 5 W's and 1 H. When was this incident? Where did this take place? Why were you late? What's the reason behind this? Who were you with? Or who are you visiting during that event when you came in late? And then how? How did you change this habit in the future? Something like that. The problem is, if you have answered all of the bullet points in the task card, but still you fail to reach 1 minute, you expect a penalty in speaking task 2. That's why it's important to build your vocabulary, to come up with an interesting opening statement, and then follow the outline that we have suggested. But the others have problems with concluding their statement. That's why here, if you look at the handout, we also have examples on how to conclude your statement. Sir Brian, let's take a look at some of the sample closing statements.
Well, a very good way of concluding is in conclusion.
Mhm.
However, some people can actually use more creative ways of concluding their answer in part 2 of the examination. For example, they can say, to sum up, or to summarize. You could also say as a whole or on the whole. This is a very good expression that you could utilize in your speaking examination to sum up something. For example, you could say, on the whole, colors are really very important because they help people express themselves in different ways and also inspire them to have a brighter outlook in life. So that's a very good way of concluding your answers in the second part of the examination.
Guys, some IELTS candidates are having problems or troubles with opening statements and closing statements. For those of you who are quite new to IELTS preparation, we want to inform you that there are a lot of questions in IELTS, whether speaking or writing, that ask you to talk about your opinion. But Sir Brian and I have been teaching IELTS for more than 15 years already. That's why we have met plenty of IELTS experts locally and internationally, because there are a lot of online workshops that are offered exclusively to IELTS agents. And because we are in the business for the longest time, we're always invited by the 2 testing centers, IDP and the British Council. These examiners notice a lot of candidates always start with in my experience.
Mhm.
But if you keep on saying, in my experience, let's say 5 times or 6 times all throughout your 11 to 14 minute speaking task, you don't expect to get a higher grade for vocabulary and lexical resource. So we have here some of the examples, and I'd like to show you or to share with you other alternatives because Sir Brian did his part earlier. Let's take a look at some of these. You may say, from my point of view, instead of repeating, in my opinion, all the time. Alternatives that you can use, it appears to me that, or you may also say, from what I've learned, and the next time you'd like to repeat, in my opinion, why don't you say something like, honestly speaking? What you've noticed so far, the words that we are using are not complicated. Because in the speaking subtest, you're supposed to casually converse with your examiner. Don't visualize your examiner as someone who is grading your performance. Just imagine that your examiner is someone you get to meet, let's say, along the hallway. And when you meet someone along the hallway, what are you supposed to do? You don't use complicated language just to impress that person, right? What's most important, you are understood by that person. So in IELTS, accuracy and number 2, variety. Don't forget these 2 main ingredients to IELTS speaking success. So we've considered opening statements, closing statements, and expressing your opinion. FYI, once again, to the beginners in IELTS preparation, there are a lot of questions that ask you to compare and contrast, meaning to say examiners are going to ask you what are the similarities, what are the differences. And once again, we have here a list of words that you can probably use when you'd like to compare or contrast. Would you like to share some of these, Sir Rai?
There's a long list here, and you should study this because in part 3 of the examination, there are plenty of questions that ask you to compare and contrast. So when you're talking about similarities, you could probably say similarly. Another alternative will be in the same way as, okay? And if you want to contrast, you could say despite or in spite of, however, whereas, and alternatively, which is one of my favorite words. Okay, and when you could probably say alternatively, that makes you a little bit more sophisticated as an English speaker.
We'd like to reiterate that in IELTS speaking and IELTS writing, there are quite a lot of similarities when it comes to the questions. So just because that question comes out in speaking, it doesn't mean that you'll never encounter it in the writing subtest. How did we know that? Like, as what we've mentioned, we've been teaching since 2006. So that means to say, our students come back to us and update us. And that's when we've come up with a conclusion that, oh, when IELTS candidates prepare for questions in speaking, these are likely to come out in the writing subtest as well, and vice versa. In the writing component, a very popular type of question is agree or disagree. So what we're going to share with you in the next few minutes will help you not just in IELTS speaking, but also in IELTS writing.
True.
Imagine if you say, I agree, but the word agree appeared 5 times or 6 times all throughout the writing task.
Yeah.
You're supposed to come up with at least 250 words. And if you repeat the word agree, it won't help your cause. So we have here some of the alternatives. Number 1, you might want to say, I'm completely on board. Or you might want to say, you're absolutely right. The difference is, if you say you're absolutely right, it's possible to do that in the speaking subtest, but not in writing.
Yeah.
Why? Because you sound what? As if you are talking to someone face to face. But in the writing subtest, the language has to be formal. As much as possible, try to avoid first person and second person pronouns like we, us, our, you, your. These are words that you have to try to avoid in the writing component. But in speaking, it's totally fine for you to say, you know what, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Let's consider others. If you don't want to agree with something, you might want to say, I'm afraid that I don't agree with that. Or, I see your point. It's just that. You might also want to say, the thing is, it's not always true. These are different ways on how to express your opinion, whether you when you're asked to agree or disagree with something. Sometimes IELTS questions don't just ask about personal stuff. Sometimes there are conceptual stuff as well. And when you are not so certain of your response, we want you to know there's no moral judgment whatsoever of your answer. That's why there are instances when it's best to speculate, but
Yes.
make sure it's an intelligent guess. Okay? I've learned from IELTS examiners, try not to use the word maybe, because when you say maybe, you are unsure. So instead of just saying maybe, you might want to say perhaps.
Perhaps,
Or we have a list of the words here that Sir Brian can perhaps share with you. Sir Brian, what are other terms that candidates can use when they are speculating about a specific answer?
So apart from I think, which is very commonly used in the speaking examination, you could say it's possible. Or apart from perhaps, which is also commonly used in the speaking examination, you could say, I sometimes wonder. That's really good. And I imagine that. Or it could possibly be the case that, right? These are some alternatives that you could use in your speaking examination when you're speculating something.
So let's have a recap of what we have discussed so far. We gave you examples how to play with words in your opening statement, closing statement, when you're asked to share about your experience, give your opinion, when you compare and contrast, and when you speculate. Once again, we have just given you a few examples because you'll notice there are 3 pages on this handout. If you'd like to have a full list of the alternatives in order to avoid repetition, don't forget to visit nineronline.com. You sign up for your free trial, or you can have the full access for only $13 per month, and that's the most affordable English test preparation in the world. In our future videos, we're going to talk about improving your vocabulary in IELTS writing. We're also going to consider a discussion on phrasal verbs. And if you have suggestions, just send us an email, a Facebook message. We always listen to whatever you have to say because that's just what we are. We are 9.09ers. So guys, we'll see you in our future videos.
Bye, guys.
Bye.